Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton, and today we're talking about the new RWBY set. There are a lot of decks that can be built with these cards, but I'm going to focus on the one that I found most interesting, which is the 8 standby build. The deck wins by gaining advantage the same way that standby decks do, by getting big 1/1s, 2/2s, and other things that build board onto field as early as possible, and then playing a pair of endgame combos, one of which stands the standby target and shuffles back cards into our opponent's deck, and the other punishes that newly reshuffled deck with big burns and clock kicks. The object of the deck is to get as many standby triggers and standby climaxes played out of hand as possible in order to make our board as big as we can, as soon as we can, and also to get all of our endgame stuff on board. Competitively, it's a little early to say. I think we will see it at Rumble, and I think it has the potential to do just fine. Standby lists are pretty well positioned in the meta right now. I don't think it's as good as the Dal and Slime standby lists, but I think that as a standby list, with some really nice synergy and the ability to build really big board states, I think it's in a position where it can really power over some of the 1k1 stuff that we're going to see in like the middle of the meta tiers. As far as cost goes, it's not bad. The most expensive card in the deck is still less than $10. It shouldn't be hard to get these cards. They should be pretty available wherever you buy your cards. And given that it's a popular set and a lot of people are going to be trying to reach for those SPs, there's a lot of product out there. Should be pretty easy to build this on a decently reasonable budget. So let's get into the cards. The level 0 game is mostly about trying to get standby climaxes into hand, trying to get through the deck, and get our memory condition met. That memory condition is this Pyrrha. It's a Kome. When it's reversed, top check 3, add a card, ditch a card. This can add climaxes or events. And when it's reversed, it goes to memory. Unlike a lot of other memory conditions, it doesn't require us to pay one or do anything else in order to get this into memory, which overall saves us stock over the long term. The level 3 RWBY requires 2 of these in our memory, and there's a level 1 bomb that we play that can also send these to memory from waiting room. So if we don't get the reverse condition, if these get bombed to other zones as they can, if they get denied somehow, we still have another way to get them into our memory. On reverse means that whatever that fix is going to be for next turn, but it does let us dig for climaxes, lets us get stuff out of our hand, including standby targets that we would rather have in waiting room. Next, we run 4 of the James Ironwood. On play, ditch 1, draw 1, and on play, ditch 1, top check, and we can salvage a character with a level equal to or lower than the level of the card that we revealed. Free top check in standby is huge. It's even better when we can add it into hand. We use the second ability first to top check. We are guaranteed to get something because we can salvage zeros, and the 0 lineup in RWBY is good enough that we don't mind salvaging a 0. But more importantly, if it's a trigger, we can draw it into our hand with the other ability, slam it down, start getting our board together immediately. Also, this is one of a couple of top check effects that we have. Top check is really good for brainstormers. It basically makes them all 5-card brainstormers. So if that top card is clean, we can get it off the top of our deck so that our brainstorm can go into 4 cards that have a better chance of being a climax. So it makes our brainstormer that much more effective. I don't like brainstormers very much, so if I'm going to play a brainstormer, it usually has to have a good second effect, and this does. It's a salvage brainstormer, Nora Valkyrie, that gives another character 500 power when we get a reverse. So, when our big board reverses something on our opponent's board, we can give something else 500 power. That's really useful. That extra bit of power can really help us get over, especially in other standby matchups. But it also helps us on defense because if we play a backup or if our board is just big and people have to crash into what we have, we can give power to other things, forces our opponents to play a certain way, and helps us maximize our efficiency defensively. Also, because we run a couple of different things that top check on play, quite often during the game we're going to be able to turn this essentially into a 5-card brainstorm. It makes us more effective, especially in the first deck when we want to use it so that we can get through a deck that doesn't have a level 1 combo that mills us. The other top check is also on a climax swap. This RWBY, on play, top check, we can leave it on top or we can mill it, and we can also pay 1 climax swap on play. Again, top check in standby, we can see if we're going to trigger or not, or if we need to get a certain climax in hand, we can move a climax that we reveal off the top into waiting room so we can swap a little more efficiently. This is good. This is a good profile. We play 2 of it because climax swap is important down the stretch because of the way that our level 3 combo works. Next, we play a couple of copies of Doggo. On play, mill 2. If there's a climax in those 2 cards, we can pitch 1 and search our deck for a remnant character. It's also a drop salvage, pay 1, pitch 1 to salvage from waiting room and give 1,000 to another remnant character. More mill, fixes our hand potentially if we reveal a climax. It also just gets more cards into our waiting room, which is good in standby because it gets us our standby targets where they need to be so that we can get them out of waiting room. It also just gets us through our deck faster and gives us targets for the drop salvage that's on the card. It's effective, it's synergistic, it makes sense, it's an easy include. Next, we play a couple copies of Lyren. It's a clock bomb, so when it gets reversed by a 0, it can send that 0 into our opponent's clock, which effectively removes things that will otherwise plus our opponent, especially things that have memory conditions that some decks need in order to get their combos down, like our deck does. This can deal with that, make that harder to get, force our opponent to use more resources to get their combos on board. It's also an on-death Ricky, so to speak. It's not a normal Ricky instead of just clocking 1 off the top of our deck. Instead, we pay 1, look at 3 from the top of our deck, choose which one of those we want to clock, mill the rest, and salvage remnant character again. Gives us more targets in the same way that the drop salvage does, gets us through our deck faster, and also puts standby targets into our waiting room where we want them. Basically works the same way any other on-death Ricky does, except it does that milling, and it also can let us fix for color in our clock. If we are missing a color that we need in this deck, it's not as important. We will want to fix for blue a little later on. This can potentially help us do that to make sure that we have blue in our level zone, but overall, it feels awkward. I'm not going to lie. It feels weird, and I've never really loved on-death Rickies in general, but the extra mill on this, in addition to the utility of being a clock bomb, gives it enough that it's quite good even if it feels awkward. And finally, last card at 0, we play 1 copy of the Sage Ayana. This card is good for certain matchups because it's an on-play blink, and on play we can give another remnant character 2,000 power. This is great in certain situations. If we are in the middle of a game with Dal and they've gotten ahead of us and they've got a board, with 2 of their 2/2s and a back row assist, and they've got 15,000 power in one spot because, they've given power from their Brainstormer and their back row Toka. They're just huge in one lane. This can blink that power away, shrinking that card back down to size, and then give one of our 2/2s an additional 2,000 power. So if we're looking at a 2/2 board on our side of the field where we have, 12-5 already, now suddenly we're 14-5 swinging into a Dow board, and if we trigger a standby, we can add even more power. If we get a reverse, we can add more power from the Brainstormer. This is really useful in certain matchups. It gets us over certain power thresholds, helps us deal with certain big boards, and it really cripples things like soul walls, anything that keeps cross-turn power. This is effective in enough matchups that it justifies its inclusion as a one-of tech piece. Moving on to level 1, it's all about building our standby board, and again, making sure that we get our end game condition. Our 1/1 standby target is Uniform RWBY. 5,500 base sits at 7,500 when we have 2 or more other remnant characters, which is a pretty easy condition to meet. This is almost exactly the same profile as the Kurumi from Dal. It doesn't get huge, but it's a big enough body in the mid game that it will give our opponents trouble. And it also has Hand Encore, which lets us replace it for the cost of a card out of hand if we're in a situation where we need to in order to keep board. It's really easy to save and decently cost efficient. We don't have the other pieces the way that Data Live does to grant this more power, so it's a little easier to step over, but overall, still very formidable, especially when it comes down, on turn 1 or turn 2, and our opponent's still at level 0, especially if they're playing like a standard level 1 combo deck that doesn't necessarily get up to size. This can give them enough trouble, even just by threatening to back it up, that it changes their line of play, grants us that extra advantage. And we do have a backup to threaten. We play 1 copy of Uniform Yang, which is a 1/1 Leafa counter, gives 2,000 power when we use it, and it also top checks and draw ditches if that card is a remnant character. Basically, defensively, this can scry for a cancel, right? We're top checking anything that isn't a climax in this list because it's all remnant characters, goes into our hand, and then we ditch it, and then hopefully the next card down or the card after that or whatever it is that we need is the cancel that we're looking for. It's a stock out, provides enough power to be useful, and it also lets us threaten to back up the 1/1s, even though we don't really necessarily need to because they have Hand Encore. We're still going to threaten to disrupt our opponent's board with this. just by having it in the deck. Our last level 1, Uniform Pyrrha. On play, if our board has 2 or more remnant characters, we can draw a Ditch. It's also a level 1 Reverser Bomb, so if it crashes into or gets swung into by a level 1 card, it will reverse that. And when it goes to Waiting Room, it sends one of those Pyrrha level 0s to memory so that we can meet our combo condition for level 3. And it can crash into 1/1 standby targets and get rid of them. Also, because we're playing standby, we swing in with this one first, usually crash with it. Hopefully we can trigger a standby that we can then drop something big over this with. Ideally, we barely lose anything on board if we even crash this, because we can immediately replace it with something that's like a 2/2 or some other big body. So we get all of the benefit from this card without leaving that open lane. Level 2, more standby targets, and of course we also run some backups. The 2/2 RWBY is honestly one of my favorite 2/2 standby targets that I've ever seen. It sits at 10/5 and we have a full back row because it gets 2,000 for each in our back row. On attack, top check puts it on top or bottom. This is fantastic because it basically gives us twice as many chances to trigger, which we really want to do, especially once we have this on board if we're at level 2, so that we can start getting our level 3 game together. We have a lot of level 3 pieces, and we want to stand by as many of them on as possible so that we can save those resources. And when we get our level 3 back row into play, this sits at 12/5. We can threaten a backup all the way to about 15 or 15/5. Really good size on offense and defense for a level 2 standby target when it has the right support in play. Digging for those standby triggers, every time we hit one, we add more power to this board. This is a really solid piece built specifically for a standby build. And these two gentlemen are our backups. The Crow, which is the red one, is the refresh counter, 2,500 backup with pay 2 refresh on it as well. If we're in a bad deck state, this can help us take care of it. It's expensive, but it's necessary in a world where you can get stuck with a whole lot of damage if you're in a really bad deck state because of how explosive some of these top ends are. The blue one, the Jacques, is a 3,000 backup that will send the reverse character to memory. This deals with pesky things that have Encore or just don't leave the field for whatever reason. And it's also a 3k punch coming back the other way. Just useful in general because of how much power it can grant. It lets those 2/2 RWBYs stay on board, and it also gets our defensive reverses so we can give more power to things with the Brainstormer. We want to get reverses on defense with RWBY whenever we can. These guys help us do that. Honestly, if you wanted to kick these numbers up, add another one of the 1/1 counters, whatever, makes a lot of sense. Running 4 backups in this list goes very well with it strategically, and as you play with this, as you tweak it, if you find that you want more backup access, it makes sense. For now, we play one of each of these because they offer different things, they bring different things to the table, but whichever one we end up with in hand gives us enough of a punch that we can usually keep our stuff alive. And then our level 3, let's talk about it. We have 2 different level 3 combos that we run in this deck. I don't know of any other deck that I've ever built or done anything with that would have run 2 level 3 combos, but the way this works is very unique because it's on standby. And we start with the level 3 Pyrrha. The combo, when the level 3 comes onto field from Waiting Room by the effect of this specific standby climax, we can pay 2 and ditch the CX to Waiting Room to stand this card, and then shuffle back into our opponent's deck a number of cards equal to the number of remnant characters on field. So, when we drop this standby climax specifically, we can bring the Pyrrha on board, pay 2, stand this, so basically like we played it out of hand, but the bonus is that we get to shuffle back probably 5 cards into our opponent's deck, assuming we have a full board, which RWBY usually will, really decompress our opponent and get an attack off with a standby target, which we don't usually get to do. And as a bonus, we also gain 1,500 power for all of our characters if this is in the front row. If we have the 3/2 back row, which we're going to talk about in a second on board, and a copy of this, we get huge in the front row. Very difficult to overcome, especially when we can threaten backup. This creates a huge board state for us potentially, and also disrupts our opponent's deck state. It either leaves them in a deck state that our other level 3 combo can really exploit, or it forces them to mill through their entire deck to play refresh counters to try to fix their deck state. The other level 3 combo is the RWBY. If 2 or more of those Piras that we talked about earlier are in memory, we can rest this card, burn 3, and clock kick the character across from it. The burn 3 is more likely to stick because we decompressed our opponent with the other combo, and then clock kick is guaranteed damage. It also heals on play, so we're usually going to want to play this out of hand, and it gains 2,000 power if all of our characters are remnant, so it sits at 11, 13 with back row support, and even more power with other potential things on board. Big body that gets around anything that is somehow bigger than it. It gets around soul walls and great performance and all that other kind of stuff. Any kind of defensive trick our opponent wants to play, this usually can get around it, basically unless it's hexproof. This combines really nicely with the Pyrrha combo, and with the clock kicks and the burns, it does enough to give us a decent chance of closing a game. The other kind of closer card that we have at level 3 is this Salem. Gains 1,000 for each of our opponent's back row characters, so if our opponent has a full board, this sits at 11, plus, again, any power from our side of the board. That can make it even bigger. On play, so not during the attack phase, we can pay 1 to either stock swap our opponent, or we can 5-card Icy Tail them. That kind of utility on a card like this makes this really powerful. If our opponent is in a good deck state and has stock that we can exploit, we can stock swap them, or we can Icy Tail them depending on the situation. This works really well, especially when we don't get the Pyrrha combo off. If we don't have the resources or the turns necessary to make the Pyrrha combo work so that we can decompress our opponent, this can help us do that with the stock swap or the Icy Tail. We can punish them for that, maybe stick some more damage, or at the very least draw more climaxes out of the deck so that the RWBY combo can be more effective. Solid one of, just as a situational piece that works in certain scenarios to give us that little bit of extra advantage, maybe do that one extra instance of damage with the Icy Tail that we need to close games. And then finally, I've made a lot of mention of this card. It's the only Weiss card in this Weiss deck. It's a 3-2 back row assist. All remnant characters in front of this gain 2,000 power. Heals on play if we play it out of hand. And we can rest it to rearrange the top 2 cards of our deck. This is the card I think we want to trigger on the Pyrrha combo turn. When we bring the Pyrrha out with the standby trigger, we hopefully have a RWBY or 2, one of the 2/2s on board as well, so that we can hopefully try to trigger to bring this on board so that we have more access to power. It's also an additional healer if we need it. And on future turns, we can rest this to rearrange our top 2 cards. Does a lot of things that we like in standby, and it has decent synergy with the rest of the board. It's also the reason that we want to have a little bit of blue fix, one of the reasons why we like to have 4 copies of that Ironwood at 0, so we can play this down if we need the heal. The strengths of this deck: 1, it's very synergistic. All the pieces work very, very well together. They flow into each other really nicely. The pieces are clearly designed to work together. They also create very big board states. It's very easy to, on that Pyrrha turn, literally have a board full of cards that are sitting at like 12, 5, 14, 15 with the threat of a backup. Just massive boards that can go toe-to-toe with any big board in the meta right now. Feels really strong on board. Lets us keep board as opposed to having to use resources to keep rebuilding. And it also has decent access to its pieces. We can usually mill extra cards for the Brainstormer. We have top checks so that we can get to our standby climaxes. We have selective salvage access at level 0. Generally good access to our cards here. Most of it's through Waiting Room, but we have so much mill that we can usually get good targets into Waiting Room, which again helps us get our standby stuff on board when we slam climaxes. The speed of the deck is as good, if not better, than any other 8 standby list we have in the current meta. Weaknesses: very limited search access. There is a drop searcher in the set. It's pretty good. Taking that in as a one-of might make sense if we feel like we're not getting enough deck access. The doggo is the best way to get it, but that's dependent on hitting a climax. This deck depends on getting stuff into Waiting Room and then salvaging that either through standby triggers or any of its many salvage effects. But if something is stuck at the bottom of the deck and we really need it, we are a little out of luck. It crutches on standby triggers. Shocking that a standby deck needs its standby triggers, but this deck, I think more than most 8 standby lists, really needs to hit its standby triggers. It has ways to dig for them, like the 2/2 and the other stuff that top checks and tries to find those climaxes to trigger. But if it falls behind early and doesn't get its triggers off, it doesn't get its board together as much, and it becomes harder to maintain that board. You have to start using that hand on core more often, maybe hard playing some stuff out of hand. We don't really want to do that, and if we don't hit our standby triggers, we can be in some trouble. And finally, the end game, as much as it's good, it's not necessarily explosive. We're still trying to hit burn 3s, and burn 3s sometimes don't stick, especially if we can't get that Pyrrha combo off, or if our opponent is playing something that allows them to recover more easily. We will not always close from 3-0 with the RWBY combo, and in a meta where 2-turn endgames are becoming harder and harder to make work, we really need to find a way to close. Sometimes this deck doesn't do that. Alright, so the mid-game board hopefully looks something like this. When I say mid-game, I'm talking about the Pyrrha turn. This is really what I think we're going for here. We want to have one of the Pyrrhas down so that we can stand and so that we can shuffle back. It is worth noting that we can only really get one copy of this Pyrrha off for the purposes of comboing. We can only do the pay to move the climax effect once on a turn. So once we have this Pyrrha down, there really isn't any point in trying to get another one down except for the additional power, which is why I think the optimal board state here is to have one Pyrrha down, a couple of the rubies, so that we can try to trigger in this back row Weiss to go with the Brainstormer that we have down, because every time we get a reverse, we can add 500 power to something with that Brainstormer. Personally, I think the ideal situation is to have 2 of these Brainstormers in the back row, so that every time we get a reverse, we're adding 1,000 power to something, and then we try to stand by over it with the Weiss when we get that chance. The level 3 board, obviously, we want the rubies down because the rubies provide that clock kick and that burn. We are going to want to play those out of hand more often than not. So if we have 6 stock, we can go boom, boom, boom across the board, get them all down because they're all going to sit pretty decently sized. They're going to sit at 13 if they've got that back row behind them, which is pretty good. And really, size isn't that important on offense because it can just clock kick whatever it faces anyway. And we obviously have the option of having the Salem here as well. This is supposed to be a closing combo. It's supposed to piggyback off of the Pyrrha so that we can actually stick either 2 of the burn 3s, or we can run 2 of these, get double clock kick, stick 1 of the burn 3s, and then get either an attack or an Icy Tail with the Salem to close. So this is usually what that board's going to look like. It does heal on play, which helps us. And we can get this board together with the Salem for 7 stock, which doesn't feel too bad. That feels pretty reachable. But even if we don't, we are probably going to be able to save something from our Pyrrha turn board. So if we want to save the Pyrrha so that it stays on board to give everything more power, we can do that. We have options here. There are things that we can do with this board. We have options. We have the power to at least make some decisions about what stays on our board, depending on how much stock we have and what state the game is in. There are quite a few other options in RWBY as well. I think one of the best cards in the entire set is this Clean Cut. The level 0 Yang that on play gives 2,000 power to something until end of turn. Ideally gives it to itself, so it's at 3-5, gets the reverse, and then clean cuts something to the back row. Doesn't work as well in this list because in standby we typically want to get to level 1 first, so we're not usually going to attack twice on that first turn if we can help it. Instead, we're going to attack once, hopefully slam a standby so we can try to get stuff on board for our mid-game. Great card, doesn't work as well in this list specifically. Kind of a similar situation with Amber Fall Maiden. This is a more standard salvage Ricky. On our turn, it sits at 3,000 power. And it also has a memory condition with the Cinder Engine, which has a really nice back row power pump at level 2, and it has its own level 3 combo. That's kind of an entire engine, as much as this is a useful Ricky. I think the green clock bomb that we talked about earlier is a little bit more synergistic for this list because it mills us a little bit more, so it gets more standby targets into waiting room, and it can also clear away certain zeros in certain matchups. Another good card from this set is the Blake Belladonna early play stock heal. It sits at 11 if we have a full back row, and its early play condition is just 2 or fewer climaxes, so really solid profile. Doesn't work as well in this list because we're more focused on trying to make sure our Pyrrha combo goes off when we're at level 2 rather than trying to meet an early play condition and get this kind of card down. Great card, wrong deck. This goes well in basically any deck that isn't the 8 standby list. And then finally we have the other 3-2 RWBY off finisher. On play we can salvage a remnant character, and at the end of this card's attack we can pay 2, pitch 2 to deal 2. I don't like this as much as the Salem because it's not quite as versatile, but if you want a guaranteed extra swing for 2 on your board, this is a good option. I can definitely see this as a one-of. So here's the list. Like I said, it's not expensive. Most of these cards are pretty easy to find just about anywhere. A lot of product being opened. It's a popular series, a popular set. And realistically, if you're going to buy into this, and even if you wanted to play this exact deck, just go ahead and buy the other options, right? Buy that drop searcher, buy the stock heal, buy these other things that might be worth including that you want to play around with and see if they work in your version of this list. Because they're easy to acquire, they're not expensive, they're not hard to find. So if you like this series or you want to play 8 Standby but you're tired of Dal, this is a good list to pick up for that. I expect to see it at Rumble, and I think it will do just fine at Rumble. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining me. We will be back on Thursday with 5 cards, 5 minutes. Gameplay for this getting pushed back a little bit because there are a lot of sets upcoming. We want to make sure we get 5 cards, 5 minutes out for all of them. On Tuesday, we will have our big Rumble preview show. We're going to talk about all of the relevant decks that we could see at Rumble, and we're going to rank them, and we're going to tier them, and it's going to be a big show, long show. Brandon and I have already had like our preliminary conversations. We are basically ready for this. It's going to be a great show. We hope you tune in for that as part of your preparations for Rumble, which is only in a couple of weeks now. And then next Thursday, we will have more 5 cards, 5 minutes. The gameplay for this video will take place after Brandon's next deck tech. He's building Batman Ninja Villains because the charity live stream chat got to that stretch goal. So we made it there. Brandon now has to build the green Batman Ninja deck. So that will be playing into RWBY in a few weeks. Keep an eye out for that. But until next time, thank you so much for joining me. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one.